Hello everyone. In South Korea, the first coronavirus case was announced on the 20th of January, and the country already started lifting the lockdown, and measures taken against the novel coronavirus outbreak has been relaxed recently. Since mid-April, actually, the so-called normalization process has been going on in the country, and currently, as Johns Hopkins University's Coronavirus Resource Center shares, there are more than 10,000 coronavirus cases in South Korea, and 256 people died because of the virus. When we look at the international media and news outlets, South Korea has been praised for fighting against the coronavirus outbreak so effectively. And now we will go to the city of Busan in South Korea and ask about it to dear Professor George Baca. He's a professor at Dong-A University in Busan, and he's a social anthropologist who is currently researching South Korean politics and nationalism. Welcome, dear professor.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for sparing time and joining us. First of all, let's start with your personal experience. You have been there in South Korea already for a while, and you experienced the whole process from the beginning in person there also. So what have you been observing about the general atmosphere in the country? Was there a panic from the day first, for instance, or were people willing to apply the measures taken against the pandemic? How was it for you?
When it first started, there was a sudden concern, and the streets went totally quiet for a few days, and it seemed stark compared to the rest of the world, because China had already had its problems. And Korea reacted, but then within a short period of time, everything went kind of back to normal. The only thing is almost everybody was wearing a mask. So one of the things in Korea is conformity. People conform to rules almost 100%, and it's a social thing. And so once one person started wearing a mask, everybody, and in the first stages, I would count. And if I would go out, I could count like 250 people wearing a mask with 1 or 2 people not. And even now, I would say more than 90 out of 100 wear masks. But then what happened was there was a very interesting situation in Korea, because you had mentioned their tracking strategy, and so they would document the cases, and so they had case number 1, case number 2, and they kept on going, and things seemed to be normal. But then they came across what is now the notorious case 31. And case 31, she is a member of this cult. There's a Christian cult in Daegu. And what happened was she was confirmed with the virus, and she did not stop going out. And not only did she continued to go out, but she continued to attend her church. And it's one of those mega churches. And so what happened is she spread the disease. Because if you look at the Johns Hopkins website, you will notice that Seoul, with 20 million people, has a very low number. And Busan, that has 2 million people, we have something very low, like 200 or 300 people. But if you look at Daegu, which is a smaller city, Daegu's got like 65% of Korea's cases. Mm-hmm. So at that stage, what happened is there was this huge alarm, and the alarm was focused on this religious cult, and this specific religious cult has been infamous in Korea for quite a while. So a lot of the attention focused on that, and what was really, really interesting is in this early stages is people assumed that Korea was kind of a dangerous place to be. And part of the reasons why people perceived it is like you said, as soon as there was cases in Wuhan, the Korean authorities started to act, and they also enlisted the help of businesses, biomedical companies, and they kind of got everybody organized. So what that did is that kind of was an alarm for people outside of the country, and so people, I got phone calls from friends in Europe and the United States, and they were worried about my health and everything, and things seemed to be going okay, and then in a very short time there was the explosion in Italy, and then France and Spain, and then now by far the worst is the United States. And so there was a certain moment where it became ironic as Korea went from being kind of this danger zone to being the safest place to be. And to this point, it is the safest. And you talked about how they started this process of normalization. For at least 5 or 6 weeks, people have been going back to normal. Like, I live right next to a beach, and for the last 6 or 7 weeks, in the afternoon, I usually take my dogs walking on the beach, and the beach has been full of people. So Koreans have kind of gone back, and so now it's a very so the experience has been kind of pleasant because I don't have to go to the university. So that's the only thing that's a little bit different is the university, but everything else is normal functioning. So we called the early stages, we called it a lockdown, but once Italy went into real lockdown, and all of these other countries went into, and a lot of the countries, even my brother in California is locked down. Once the rest of the world really did go into lockdown, we came to realization that we're not locked down in Korea. And so it's very, you can go to a restaurant, you can go to a coffee, like the coffee shops are full all the time. And I even saw some videos. We just had a holiday last week in Korea, a 5-day weekend, and I saw some pictures of amusement parks, and the amusement parks were jam-packed. So yeah, absolutely crazy. So the issue is the Korean authorities have contained this situation. So it's fully contained. That I'm thinking that there might be another round, but for the most part, they've got it pretty contained for sure. Now the question is are they, are we going to celebrate them for containment, or are there some criticisms about the process? But in terms of actually living through this pandemic, I see it as fully contained.
Yeah, as you mentioned, and also I touched upon it at the beginning, South Korea has been really praised for the way of approaching to this novel coronavirus outbreak as the best, and the number of the cases and those who died because of the virus seem to be proving that the government did a good job at containing it, as you also mentioned. But these 4 main steps to strategy: testing, tracking, tracing, and treating. So perhaps the 2 in between, tracking and tracing, would be the most problematic ones that we should talk about. Do you agree with or what are the parts that you might have some reservations about this whole process?
Well, the admiration for Korea has to be looked at in the context of the fact that Western democracies, as you call them, I'm not as liberal with that word, but they self-define as democracies. But it's admired in the context that these major countries are upside down in all kinds of problems, especially the United States, Britain, and then another country has a real problem with it is Brazil, and with Bolsonaro. And they have these kind of authoritarian type of leaders that have approved of a very laissez-faire kind of liberalization of the economy. And so what has happened is their political opponents. So in the West, in Western Europe, the social democratic types, or in the United States, the Democratic Party, they have been attacking people like Trump for his abysmal attempts to deal with this. And so, in that light, it looks good. It looks good, but and what's interesting is this position it becomes kind of a liberal or social democratic position, but the reality is what Korea's authorities did is they protected their economy, and they protected their economy in a systematic way, and they used the power of the state to do it. So I find it really ironic that this has become a rallying point for leftist or some kind of critique, because one of the biggest problems with that is that Korea, much like these Western industrialized countries, for the past 20 years, it's been going through a lot of political problems where social inequality is growing, and your average Korean is swimming in horrendous household debt. And the corporations that dominate in Korea, much like the corporations in the West, they have these amazing levels of profitability at the moment that they're not creating any new jobs. So you've got these, brilliant profits on one hand, where your average Korean is getting poorer and struggling. So what is happening by celebrating the Korean response is you're kind of legitimizing these economic policies that are increasing inequality. So that's a problem. So the fact that they're being responsible is actually, well, shouldn't they be responsible? Now, what this highlights is it doesn't highlight that Korea is doing anything special that we should celebrate. What it highlights is the inept way in which these certain actors in the United States and in Western Europe are totally mishandling the situation. That's what's important. Now, back to what you mentioned before, you're absolutely right. These issues number 2 and 3, the tracing and tracking, are obviously the most problematic, because what these strategies, and these are the strategies that are central to the South Korean government's success, is what these really are, if we use good social science language, is surveillance. And so for example, every time somebody is confirmed with a coronavirus, I get a text message, and the text message tells me which neighborhood that they live in. And so, like, for example, I just got one earlier, and the neighborhood next to mine, that somebody was confirmed. Then it tells you where that person has been in the previous week or so. And I found it, and so since it's been going on, it's been interesting, because I'm like, I remember when it first happened, I actually recently moved, so my old neighborhood, there was somebody that was in it that got, the coronavirus, and then, I became aware that that person lived somewhere around me, and then I even noticed, where that person had been the previous week and a half or something like that. But it turns out you're like, well, how do they get that information? The tracking part, so the person, is registered because they have a national health system here, which is quite good. But then the way that they do the tracking is through CCTV. You know, they have these CCTV cameras everywhere, and so what happens is then they don't ask the person, where have you been? Instead, they track them through surveillance cameras.
The camera is just
And
leaving constantly.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And what you know they authorities can find us no matter what, you know, because we leave this print of where we have been with our credit cards and all of these different things, and so it's quite easy to collect this information. But South Korea has a surveillance state or surveillance system that's par excellence. And so this has been the basis of it. And then it also goes back to what I mentioned before, this conformity. Is there is a certain fear of authority and the government. And so people, you know, so in a certain sense, it's also kind of a legacy of the, you know, the authoritarian past. So yeah, so these are things that I think the social democrat, you know, quote unquote liberal left in United States and Western Europe, they don't really understand this aspect, because if they actually lived under the conditions and saw what was happening, I think that they would find that very problematic, you know.
Yes. So what you mentioned just here is takes us into a deeper irony, actually, because
Yeah,
what the what in the West is being preached, that
yeah,
South Korea is fighting against this outbreak pretty successfully, is like the Western countries seem to ignore the details about
yeah,
how this has been done, and the
yeah,
details, as you just mentioned, that we would be perhaps talking about some dystopia book or film
yeah,
scenario type kind of details.
yeah,
But mostly the economists, mainly economists, are saying, for instance, quote unquote, they say like the world should look at South Korea as an exit strategy to recover from this whole
yeah,
outbreak, the pandemic. So mostly the economic side has been
yeah.
put the front line.
Yeah, from an economics point of view, or but a specific type of an economics, a pro-capitalist economics. You know, so within within this economics field, there is this problem with the fact that we've had to shut down the government, or shut down the economy, excuse me. And so what this shows is how things have become upside down, because originally the argument of capitalism is it's the best and most efficient means for providing the basic needs and services of society. So society is actually better because capitalism has this efficiency of production and distribution of goods through its, you know, markets and supply and demand. Well, you know, from that, if you believe in that, then what that means is that the market and the economy is subordinated to the needs of people. But these economists, what they're showing is that it's actually the other way around. It's that society has been subordinated to the economy, and so they're looking for these strategies of how do we get the economy going. And if you are really focused on the economy as the number one thing, of course, South Korea is the best possible way of doing things. But the problem is the economy, because the economy actually led to this outbreak in many ways. You know, this outbreak is a problem of the economy. And so yeah, I agree. But now, once again, that also gets into an internal debate within the West of economists, because you have this you know, the quote unquote neoliberal economic model, where you allow the market to work its magic with as little government interference as possible. And this approach is understanding that markets have to be managed to some degree or another. The insight of Keynes, the Keynesian idea of markets are great. They do provide the basic needs that we need as a society. It's very pro-capitalist, but at least it understands that markets are not naturally self-regulating, that they need to be managed. And South Korean authorities are showing that they have a certain acumen for managing this crisis in terms of its economic needs. But it also draws attention to a certain arrogance in the U.S., because the U.S. has kind of this tradition of American exceptionalism, seeing it as separate from the rest of the world. So when there was the outbreak in Wuhan, there was this idea, wow, there's this horrible thing going on with these horrible people, doing horrible things, eating bats and all this, these horrible wet markets. And there was this ability for the managers of the state, the leaders like Trump, to kind of ignore what was going on. Where in Korea, the moment that the leaders here understood that there was a problem in Wuhan, they knew it's going to be here in Korea immediately. And in fact, they had a bioscience firm that before the government could even give them directives, they were able to get the blueprint of the corona disease, because the Chinese authorities put it on the website. So they didn't even have the actual virus. They got the blueprint, and then they immediately started making the test kit, which is now the most prolific test kit around. So it also just illustrates a whole different kind of viewpoint where the Korean authorities definitely had a much better sense of their interrelationships with these kind of global patterns of supply chains and markets.
Before we close the discussion, if there's anything you would like to add?
The Korean response, is actually, on one hand, if you ask me from a very personal level, I actually like the fact that I'm in Korea rather than somewhere else, because they have handled it so well on a certain level. But the big problem is it's now being used by the Korean elite to legitimize this political order that has many, many problems with, growing inequality, some of the worst household debt or the worst household debt in Asia. And so I don't want to become like an ideological tool for the Korean oligarchs.
Thank you so much for sparing your time and joining me at this discussion. Dear Professor George Baca from Dong-A University in Busan, South Korea, was my guest, and we discussed South Korea's strategy against the novel coronavirus outbreak. Thank you for watching us.